So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to your origin story. How did you get into pulp and science fiction and fantasy?
Oh wow, didn't get an intro. The hell? Where's my intro?
Don't do intros.
Everyone just knows who I am. That's cool. I like that. Um, how did
I'll
I?
pre-record one later.
No, you don't have to. I want no special treatment, Steve. I'm not Beyonce. It's fine. It's all good. So the question was, what got me into fantasy and sci-fi?
Yeah, and pulp, the whole thing. Where did it start?
Um, it, do you know? I feel sometimes it's always a different answer I give people. One of my standard answer,
Mm,
I think, is when I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. That certainly gave me the bug for pulp adventure. Um, and then there were other things that sort of came afterwards, like Tales of the Gold Monkey. There was another show I think called Bring Her Back Alive, stuff like that. But also around before, to kind of bring it back around to writing, before I actually saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, I'd started reading Doc Savage books,
mm.
and I'd gone to my local, and I'll never forget, I think it was called The Thousand Headed Man, and it was at a picture of like Doc Savage. And for those who don't know, Doc Savage is kind of like a precursor to Superman,
Yeah, yeah.
but like the human sort of version, because he didn't have superpowers or anything like that. He was just extremely well trained. But there's a lot of similarities because his name was Clark Savage Jr., Clark Kent. He was called the Man of Bronze, where you had the Man of Steel. He
Yep.
had a Fortress of Solitude, and and I remember seeing that cover, and there was just something about the cover. I think he was fighting like a giant snake, and he was always fighting something like that. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna get this book out of the library, and I just rinsed it. And this was back in the day where like when I was much younger and had time. Um, and I think I read it in a day. I think I just went and then went back to the library and got whatever books I could get. There weren't that many Doc Savage that I could find. It was just a sort of lucky find. Um, but again, like everyone else, it was the Raiders, it was Star Wars. Being a sort of kid of the '80s, you name an '80s sort of film of that time, all of them just kind of hit me, you know. And that kind of was where my love of it sort of blossomed, I guess. And then indie just honed it, I think. And that was the one I always kind of quote because that was the one that got me writing because I went to see it and came home. And I remember I just had this urge to do something with it. I had this kind of
Right.
feeling, I was so excited about it, but I didn't know what to do. And it was my mum who had said, why don't you just, write something, a story or something like that.
Yeah.
So I started writing, and I remember eh, some of my stories had awful titles and all like rip-offs of films and stuff like that. Because I used to write with Dave, who's my co-host on Geek Syndicate, and we used to write together at school. Although Dave was extremely lazy, and I ended up going off on my own and kind of write my own stuff. And the first thing I remember writing, it was called, which we'll come into later, but it was called Trail of the Cursed Cobras, which I think I was like 12 when I started that. Um, and it was it was basically a Raised Lost Ark ripoff.
Right.
Um, and I think he was a lord. He was Lord Douglas Blackthorn. And he was hunting for these cobras, and the enemy was his arch enemy was called Overlord, which is really like obviously groundbreaking that I'd come up with such a name for a master criminal. No
Yep.
one's done that since.
No.
And I don't, to be honest, if they'd ever done a film with it, I probably would have got Michael Ironside. I don't know why. It's just suddenly I never thought about it before, but suddenly I was like, yeah, I am Mike Ironside. Yeah, he would
Yeah,
have made a great Overlord.
you could do it.
And yeah, and even at that age, I kind of thought to myself, just feels like I'm ripping stuff off, and I really want to start. I really want to be able to write my own stuff,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
and by that, not stuff that I've just written, but stuff that felt like it come from me, and not just I've literally just cherry picked stuff from things that have inspired me.
Yeah.
And it took me, I think, many years really to get to that stage, and I think it was only when my first sort of proper book, I guess for me, which was back in the day traditionally published, was a book called Paladin, which you can't really get hold of now.
Mm.
And I think for me that was, again, it was that kind of pulp adventure, but it was more in the vein of like your Romancing the Stone, Jewel in the Nile type adventure. It was
Right.
much more kind of tongue in cheek, much more fun, and that weirdly was almost kind of, it was centered around it was centered around the writer. He was an author, and yes, he was similar to me, but it was kind of, the idea of it was is that he'd made a living writing all these heroic characters, but he himself was not very heroic at all, much like myself. And but through the course of the novel, you know, he comes to the realization that actually he's much closer to the characters than even he thinks, and that was kind of like his journey and stuff. And I had a great time, writing Paladin, but I still kind of felt at the back of my mind this wasn't the story yet. Do you know what I mean? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you must get that. You know, you kind of, sometimes it takes a certain amount of stories, and then suddenly you're kind of in it. You're in that sweet spot, and you're like, this is what I wanted to be writing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's that journey to get to that point. Doesn't lessen the other things that you've done, but everything's a bit of a stepping stone. And then weirdly, this is probably the longest answer you've ever had to one question. But then, you know, weirdly, as luck would have it, my friends had all kind of been aware that I was writing these stories and stuff, and they got annoyed that they weren't in any of the stories. So they said, like, you know, we want to be in the story, we want to be in the story. So I'd said to them, mainly to get them off my back, to say, right, you come up with the characters, you go away, come up with the characters, you give me the characters, and I'll write a story. I genuinely thought that's done. I can forget about that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I kind of left it, and I can't remember how long I left it for. But then all of a sudden, they'd come back with characters, which I wasn't expecting. Now, some of them would literally just give me a name. Some of them just gave me a name, like Joshua Gray. You know, others gave me literally a full character profile, like Ben Ashodi, which if you've read, you know, Fallen Heroes, you'll know some of the characters' names I've just thrown out. And I was like, oh my God, I wasn't actually expecting them to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I took the names away, took the characters away, and they were so different. I was kind of like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with this, let alone craft any sort of story out of it. And I just thought, oh, I'll knock something together again to kind of, you know. And the more I worked on these characters, the more I grew to love them. And then the story kind of came together from that. But what I realized was that it didn't really back then anyway. The term, like things like urban fantasy didn't exist as a genre.
No.
Um, so it was a mix of genre. You know, it was a mix of genres. It was pulp adventure. It was spy thriller. It was supernatural. It was all this kind of mix of stuff. You know, and kind of from that, you know, obviously Fallen Heroes came out of it. And yeah, as I worked on it, I realized this was it. This was the story that I wanted to tell. It felt me, and it was pulling together all those genres that I loved as a kid, and just throwing them into like a cement mixer and then seeing what comes out the other side.
But back when we started writing novels and stuff, this is going back a while now. When I started, you know, there wasn't any such a thing as self-publishing, not to the extent that it exists today. Today, it's such a different thing. It's such a different animal. But back then, there was traditional publishing, and there was basically vanity press, which is where you send your book to a company, they will print it, regardless of whatever is in it, they'll print it and send it back to you, and then it's up to you to hand sell the books to whoever will buy it. But back with Paladin, you said it was traditionally published?
It was published with a company. I think it was called Dohan Books. I think it was back then. Yeah.
So you're like an editor and all that sort of stuff.
It did have an editor, but I mean, even though it was traditionally published, I mean, I didn't pay them or anything like that.
Yeah.
Kind of looking, you know, I don't think it was very well edited.
Right.
You know, and it's one of the things that are back of my mind. I'd like to I think as a writer, you always want to move forward. You don't really want to go back. You don't really want to be, I want to pick up that book way back and kind of rewrite it. I don't think you want to do that. I
No, you
think you
don't.
want to, but I loved the characters in that book.
Hmm.
And some of those characters, if you know Paladin, which is a handful of people really, they've been sort of sprinkled around uh, Fallen Heroes and Forgotten Warriors. Some of those characters have popped up. Um, so it is kind of that same world, that same sort of universe, and I kind of the plotting that I'm doing on the third book, I kind of really double down on that. So a lot of the stuff that went on in Paladin kind of comes into the sort of third book, and it's my way of kind of paying tribute to those characters. But I would love to sort of revisit it sort of properly. But yeah, you're right. You know, back then, certainly when I started, it all there was no um, KDP, there was no Create Space or any of those sort of companies that were out there doing this stuff. It was Lulu was the company that I used,
Yeah.
and again they were still kind of in their infancy. I mean, this was what 2008, 2009, and the reason behind the choice to kind of self-publish really was that I had sort of sent it out. I'd approached publishers, not so much agents, but I'd approached publishers. I think back then as well, I think it was easier to kind of get your foot in the door with a
Yeah.
publisher.
Yeah.
They were more likely. I think I don't know what happened, but I think now it's just an explosion of of talent and everyone's writing, and I think the slush piles they call it is just mammoth. I think compared to back when I was getting out there, and I think even then it was still mammoth. And I approached quite a few publishers, and I got some responses and stuff, not just the standard, thanks but no thanks, but a lot of the responses that I was getting as reasons for not doing it was that they couldn't pin it to a genre.
Interesting.
So like I said, nowadays I could pitch it as urban fantasy, but to be honest, nowadays you can kind of pitch it as a lot of different
Yeah.
genres. Or you could just literally just pitch it as fantasy, because I think nowadays fantasy covers a much broader spectrum. Back
Mhm.
then, if you said fantasy, if your cover didn't have a bloke with a sword in his hand, you're done.
Yep.
And yeah, so they couldn't pigeonhole it. So what they said was it would be extremely difficult to market.
Mm.
So again, it was thanks but no thanks. I did get a couple of rejections, not to put not too fine a point in it, because they didn't like the fact that I did have a lot of the main characters weren't white.
Yep.
So I got some for that, which was, again, a bit of an eye opener at the time. So in the end, I just decided, do you know what? I don't know how, but I'm going to do this myself. I wanted to get the story out there, so I just thought I was going to do it myself. So I actually I remember getting the book on how to self-publish. I still have it, and it kind of took you through the whole process and how to do it. And that was how I found Lulu and stuff like that. And I guess the only idea I had in my head going into it is I want it to look as good as anything else on the bookshelf.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that if you pick them up, and I was seeing a lot of self-published stuff, and you could see straight off that self-published, that's published. And what I wanted was, if someone picked up Fallen Heroes and they picked up another book that was, they would be like, um, so I put a lot of time and effort into it. I got someone. I mean, obviously, like you say, a lot of this, Steve, but I got someone to professionally do a cover for me. I got it professionally edited and just put a lot of time and effort into the marketing and stuff. And obviously, he says, spinning back,
Mm-hmm.
because I never published this version of it because this is the hardback. But this was the first copy that I got of it. which is still kind of a proof, but that was it. And when I sort of, I mean, even the back of it's completely different because I completely changed it because this was just this is whatever like Lulu gave you. Do you know what I mean? Like the blog standard stuff. And I was kind of like, right, this is what I wanted. This is what I wanted. And I then had to go that uphill struggle because then I decided, I want to try and get this into a bookshop. And I contacted, when I say by hand, I didn't sit there and write them, but I sat and typed it by hand. So I had a kind of template, but I sort of changed it for each store. And I contacted something stupid like 200 branches of Waterstones. And as luck would have it, my local branch and a couple of other branches were interested. But back then, I think now it's even harder. But because of the way a self-published book works, because normally it's done on sale and return, isn't it? Is it sale or return? I
think so.
get
Yeah,
confused now. With traditional. So obviously, if you send them, a load of, I don't know, like 1,000 copies for a particular author, if you only manage to sell 50, you can send back the other copies and stuff and get your money back and stuff. I think that's kind of how it works. Whereas with with self-published stuff, you had once you've paid that money for those self-published copies, that's it. Your money's gone. So that made it really hard for bookshops to take that chance, and all the other sort of stigma that's around that was heavily around self-publishing then, which I think is still there, it hasn't gone away. But back then it was even worse. If you were self-publishing, basically you were doing, it was vanity. That and I remember it was a branch manager of my local Waterstones. I'd sent her a copy and she'd taken it away. She read it. She got back in contact, said she loved it, and she went and ordered a load of copies for the store, even after telling me the difficulties of doing self-published stuff, which I've just sort of told you. That's when I found all that stuff out. They did well, and then she invited me in to do like a book signing, which was amazing. And then the Milton Keynes branch invited me to do a book signing, which was amazing. And another branch invited me, and then I'd found out that that they'd stocked copies like in the flagship branch, which is in like Piccadilly. So yeah, so it was a great time, really.
Well, we should say that this was a couple of years ago now that Fallen Heroes came out, and you did these signings. And as we said, self-publishing's, there's still some stigma, as you said, but I think it's definitely improved.
Oh God, yeah.
What's really interesting is, you've obviously, for those who don't know, Fallen Heroes was the first, and you finished the second book in the trilogy. But in the middle of that, you then started doing something else, which nowadays they call it an expanded universe, or a multi. It's not even multi-genre; it's multi-platform product. Or
I mean, the term they used to use, which I don't use so much now, is transmedia. But they don't really. I think that term seems to have kind of gone the way of the dodo a little bit. It's not used as much, I think. But yeah, I think multi-platform, that sort of thing.
So, what came after Fallen Heroes? What came first? Did you then start developing comics? Was that the next thing?
Well, it was. Again, I think most of my writing career, and just career in general, just seems to be a series of like lucky happenstance, and just I don't know, just happening, and me just looking back, going, how did that happen? But basically, what happened was I'd obviously bought out Fallen Heroes, and this was actually quite a number of years after Fallen Heroes had come out, and I was doing the podcast and stuff. And I got approached by a comic company at the time, who had read the novel. Shout out to Nick Wilkinson, because she was kind of spearheading it all. And they approached me to do they wanted to do an adaptation of the novel. And I'm a massive comic fan, so I was kind of like, yeah, where do I sign up? I leapt at the chance. And they put together like a sort of a team, so artist, writer, colorist, all the rest of it, and we started working on it together. And sadly, the actual company, we were about halfway through doing. I mean, the first issue was scripted, and we were about halfway through the art of it, and and basically the company we're under, and we were kind of just left with this. What do we do now? And the team wanted to keep going, but we didn't have any cash to do it, so I kind of put the call out, and we sold ad space within the comic to basically fund the rest of the comic, to fund sort of the initial print run for the comic and stuff. So we were able to get it finished, and we got that first comic out, and then we did a second issue, and then sadly, like we didn't do any more, so we weren't able to sort of finish the adaptation. But what happened whilst this was going on was that a writer, Sideton, had read the book and had been raving about it to Nick, because they're partners or whatever. And then Nick had sort of said, well, why don't you talk to Barry? Maybe he's interested in doing something, because I was a comic writer. So she basically knocked our heads together, because I was a massive fan of Si's work. And he sort of said, well, what do you want to do? And I kind of said, well, look, I'm easy. I said, you've read the book, I said, pick a character that you like and then pitch me a story. And it was as simple as that. And he took the Reverend, which is kind of this sort of vigilante, sort of Punisher type character, who's also a former priest. And he did this like amazing pitch for him, which was kind of like an origin story to a certain extent. And it turned out that the art team from the adaptation really liked the idea, so they were like, can we get involved? And I was like, yeah, okay. And then all of a sudden we were doing it was called Wrath of God, and we started to work on it. And then as we started to work on it, I was putting out sort of art samples and talking about the comic and stuff. And then all of a sudden, it generally was all of a sudden, I don't know how it happened, other writers and artists started approaching me and started saying, could we get involved? And I'm like, because a lot of them knew either Si or the art team, and they respected them, and they're like, well, if they're involved, and I was saying the same. By this time I had a bit of an idea, so I was saying to the writers, right, will you go away, read the book first, because if you don't like the book, then why are we even here
having this conversation?
Yeah, go away, read the book. If you like it and you want to be involved, then pick a character, pitch me a story. And that's what they did. And then all of a sudden we had 4 stories, and we had like an anthology, which was Tales of the Fallen. And then I sort of talked to Jonathan Ross, who was a big comic fan. I make it sound like, yeah, I talked to Jonathan Ross, but
we should say that you managed to get a hold of him and you got him on your podcast and interviewed him, and from there you were able to kind of say, would you have a look at this comic? And
which he did. He really enjoyed it, and he graciously did us an introduction for it. And so that came out, and it became a bit of a rolling stone. And then again, I was getting approached by more writers, more artists and stuff. And then we did another anthology, and I think that was 4 stories as well, which was Tales of the Forgotten. And then it just kept, as you know, it just kept rolling on. And then all of a sudden, we had, I think, 18 one-shot comics. So they're like the sort of small ones. They're like sort of 22 pages.
Yeah.
Which all kind of came out in the anthology. But we also had 3 sort of graphic novels, which are much longer. 100-page graphic novels and stuff. All centered on these characters. And I think one of the I can't speak to those who were involved, the writers and the artists and stuff. Obviously, they'll have their own stories about why they said yes. Um, but I know one of the reasons why the writers loved it was because they got to pitch the story, they got to choose the character. I didn't choose the character for them. I didn't choose the story from them. I was
Yeah.
very hands off in terms of scripting. They would send me the scripts, I would make suggestions and stuff like that, but not really. There wasn't really any that I kind of really tore apart in terms of it can't be done this way, blah blah blah. But it was the fact that I said everything was canon to
Right. Interesting.
the novels that I was doing. These weren't little nice side stories. Um, I said these were canon, and certainly as I was working, and it really interested me because I was working on Forgotten Warriors, which was the sequel. Um, a lot of these comics were still being worked on and being scripted, so I was kind of suggesting things. Oh, maybe go this way, and didn't really know why and stuff like that. And at the same time, I was sharing like little snippets from the sort of first draft I was working at, so they could see how their stories were impacting my own writing and the sort of story as it was going on. And to the point of one of the graphic novels, which is called The Chimera Factor, is set 6 months after Fallen Heroes, and so before Forgotten Warriors, and that story literally leads really heavily into the second book.
Yeah.
And again, it's that thing I've always said, all the stories, we've tried really hard to make all the stories stand alone. And the same with the audio drama and whatever. So that if your only route in is the comics, that's fine. You
Yeah.
can enjoy the comics, put the comics down, and you don't have to pick up the book if if you're not if you're not a fan of prose or whatever. And similarly, if you're a fan of the prose, you can pick up the books, read the books. You don't need to have read the comics. It's just about, obviously, if you've read them all, it enriches your experience, and
Yeah.
that was what I wanted to go for. And I kind of look at it now, and I can, which is why I call it the the USU, which is Unseen Shadows Universe, because that's the kind of name of the trilogy. Yes, I did kind of half nick it from the MCU. But when I was doing this, Marvel wasn't doing what it was doing.
Well, no, they
And
started 10 years ago.
yeah, and one of the ways I have always pitched it when Marvel really got themselves going was that the comics and like the audio drama and like the cheesy adventure, they're like the standalone Marvel films,
Mm.
and the books are the Avenger films.
Yeah.
Because that's where you've got the ensemble characters sort of together doing their thing, and then they sort of all branch off and do sort of different stuff. But yeah, it's been, I mean, obviously you can see sort of, he says, I came prepared. I'm not going to talk you through it, but it's just to sort of show you that like, it's kind of, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit. So yeah, I'm a day doesn't go by where I don't realize, just how fortunate I've been to the way people have kind of got involved and expanded a world, really. It's that thing of,
Interesting though to see people working on characters that you've created in a novel, and then did they ever say, oh, did they ever work out something that you hadn't told them, or did they ever come up with something really cool that made you go, huh, and made you actually kind of rethink a character?
oh God, yeah, I mean, like, for example, I mean, I'll call out Pete Rogers for two reasons. One was because I'd had a completely different opening scene for the second novel,
Right.
and it just largely for length, really. I kind of, chopped that scene, um, but still at the back of your mind, you've cut it, but it's still there. You still really like that scene. Oh. And Pete was kind of was putting together an idea that he wanted to do, and he wanted to focus on the villain, which was Oliver Cadmus, who was the leader of this cult called the Book of Cadmus. But he started back in the First Crusade, and the book is set in the modern day. So it's just, it is this kind of 900-year story in some ways. And Pete wanted to do something around there, and I gave him that little section that I'd cut
Hmm.
to have a bit of a read, and from that he crafted this whole story, but it's centered around Oliver's mother, Mary, and it's kind of all from her perspective,
Right.
and it completely. He really doubled down on the character and did a phenomenal job with it, and it really made me look at Oliver's character kind of in a different way.
Mm.
And I then ended up doing, when I then started the second novel, it does start with Oliver Cadmus, but in a different way, and it's much more. He's almost a heroic character at the start of the second book, and it's kind of showing you him in that light, and a lot
Mm.
of that did come from Pete's work, and I think one of the one of the writers. I mean, obviously, Sai is a phenomenal writer, and he always kind of like he has his handle on some of the characters, and he took a character called Bob Kelsey, who's a reporter, who kind of was a bit inspired by Kolchak,
Hmm.
the Night Stalker,
Night Stalker. Yeah.
um, and Sai just ran with him. He just ran with him, and he's a character that's kind of barely in. Um, the first book. He's kind of in a couple of chapters, And Sai did like this comic with him, and the comic is set after Fallen Heroes, and it's brilliant. It's a brilliant comic. Um, but I'd had no inkling to revisit Bob Kelsey. As far as I was concerned, as far as I was concerned, he was a kind of character. I was using him as a way to introduce the bigger character, which is Napoleon Stone,
Yeah.
But Sai had done such a great job and given him so many layers. I was like, maybe I could do something with him. So yeah, all of them, Corey, the way he writes Ben, who's basically like a master criminal, and North Londoner, and the way Corey writes him, um, I will never ever, and I've told Corey this, I would never ever let Corey write Unseen Shadows prose.
Really?
Yeah, he will never write Ben Ashodi as in prose form because he's too good at it. He's too. I've told him this. He's too. He wrote lines of dialogue that Ben said, and I would send Corey like emails saying like, "It's like you're living in my head, like you're permanently renting space in my head." But I think it's great. I think for me, I don't know how other writers would find it, but it's great working with these people because they make you up your game. Another
Mm.
one is Lizzie Boyle, um, who wrote, who was writing the Catherine Moran character, and she's a kind of psychologist who kind of gets brought into it, and she kind of hunts serial killers and all sorts of stuff that she goes on. And again, she's another one. She's there with Corey, where I've just said no, no. You're never writing Catherine Moran as prose. You put me out of a job. Yeah, it's been, yeah, because like you said, they just make you up your game. And the amount of times I went back to the second book when I was working on it and rewrote scenes because of the scripts that I was seeing, because I was like, this isn't my best work, you know.
Interesting. Interesting. It's I mean, because writing normally is such a solitary thing. It's you and the page and yourself. It's just, so it's the closest you would get to kind of having a writer's room, except
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
the showrunner essentially.
yeah. I suppose. Yeah, I guess I'd never really thought of it that way. And then there was the weird. Then when you bring the artist in, it's this weird thing of, as a writer, you have in your mind how your characters look,
Yeah.
and for the most part, unless you get an adaptation or something, that's where they exist, and you can see them visually. So when you've got people then giving you sketches of your characters, saying, how does this look, or asking you like, how do you see this character looking, on a comic page, it's a real. It was basically like casting my own TV series, which is what I was doing. I was having to, I was sending them sort of images of actors and stuff, and saying, yeah, this is kind of the actor I want and stuff like that. And then depending how long some of these projects took, I'd have to change because the actor might have changed or my view of the actor changed, you know. So yeah, it was, yeah, it's still very, I'm a very, very lucky writer.
Speaking of adaptations, Unseen Shadows universe was nearly made into a number of projects beyond the comics. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So again, it was April Fool's Day.
It wasn't.
It was
Oh God!
April the 1st. I kid you not. I got an email. I got an email from a production company,
Right.
and who, as it turned out, were the same production company that produced who made the Sharp TV series
TV
back in the
series,
day,
yeah.
saying that they had picked up copies of Fallen Heroes and it was doing the circuit around the office. They all loved it, and would I be interested in talking to them about them picking up the rights for it to be a TV show? And I honestly thought it was some elaborate April Fool's joke that someone was playing with me.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, I don't know if Dave remember. I remember ringing up Dave saying, are you winding me up or something?" You know. And then in the end, I got in contact with them, and I asked them as well, and it turned out it wasn't a wind up. They generally were interested. And I got invited down to London, and I say got invited down to London. I mean, I grew up and was born in London, so it wasn't exactly like a massive deal for me to go to London.
Yeah.
But it was to meet with them, you know, and I always remember that meeting, and realizing, and you know this, you can tell when someone's read your book and knows your book,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to someone just blowing smoke up your rear end. And I could tell that they read the book, they knew the book and stuff like that, and they were quite passionate about it, and that was a real, um, for me, it was a quite humbling moment because that happened way before all of the unseen sort of shadows and the comics and stuff. It was just a book, you know.
Mm.
And at that time, I had an agent at that time. And I remember him saying to me, I came away and I was so sort of excited about it all, and they wanted to do an option and stuff like that, and they wanted to do an option for a year, and the agent I had at the time said no, and what he said was he said a lot of, which I didn't realize this. I know we've talked about this, me and
Yep.
you, Steve, but what I didn't realize at the time was that the majority of companies that option books don't actually pay any money for the majority of the properties. I don't know if that's changed now, but back then that was the case anyway. That's what I was being told. And what my agent had said was, because a lot of authors were so excited as I was, at the prospect of their show, their book being turned into a TV show, and a lot of them just took it as a given that this is going to happen.
Yeah.
That they just signed on a dotted line, and what he was saying is a lot of these companies just sweep up loads of books just so they can have them,
Yep.
just in case, So he was pretty sure, and what he sort of said was, he said, "No, what we'll do is, one, we'll make them pay,
Yep.
because that shows they're committed, and two, we'll give them a shorter leash. So we'll give them 6 months, because that will mean A, they've had to pay for it, and B, they've got a limited time to work with it, which means actually they're gonna have to get out there and pitch it,
Yep.
And he was right. That's what I went for. They did what they called a series treatment, which I still have. I was looking at it the other day, weirdly, for something I can't actually talk about. It's only happened this week, so I can't really talk about it. But I was looking at it the other day, and I mean, it didn't get picked up, but they did work on it pretty hard. I mean, BBC nearly took it, Sky nearly took it. I think even, I don't know if HBO was around at the time, but it was a couple of the American companies nearly took it. But part of the reason it didn't happen, there were many reasons, some of which I'm not really going to get into in this podcast. But one of the big reasons was, what they were saying was, it would have needed a fair bit of money being put into it, and they saw it as it needed a kind of a US UK kind of joint deal,
Yeah.
and a lot of that wasn't happening back then.
No.
Not like you get now.
Yeah.
Also, streaming services just didn't exist.
Nope.
So even though there was still like a lot of companies they could pitch to, compared to what you have now, with the likes of Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, blah blah, go on and on and on. So I think for me it was just a case of I was kind of just a little bit too early. I like to think, I could be wrong, but I like to think had it been the days of Netflix and stuff like we've got now, I would have might have stood a better chance. But also, now you're competing with a lot more people in the genre as well now.
Yeah.
But for me, I look back on it as a massive achievement for me, because again, it was a self-published book. I did it all off my own back. There was no big publisher pushing this to be adapted as a film. My sales weren't particularly great, I'll be honest, and they knew that. That was the other thing as well, because it's one of the things they knew the sales weren't great, but they loved the story, and they were working on the basis that maybe, I didn't have that kind of marketing to get it out there to people, or for whatever reason, but they were like, nope, 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 we want it. So I still look back on that. Now it's tinged with sadness, because it's that kind of what could have happened, but also an immense level of pride, because that was what I set out to do. I wanted to create a book that would stand up against, a book which has had a lot of money pumped into it, and it's not dissing traditional publishing, that's just a fact, if which is why I wanted to go down a traditional publishing route, because you do get money pumped into your book. I mean, you don't get as much now in terms of marketing on the other side of it, which is what we talk about now. Authors now have to do a lot more than maybe they did back in the day, or unless you're a big name or whatever.
Yep. True.
But in terms of cover design, editing, typesetting, formatting, all of that sort of stuff, that's handled. Whereas when you're sort of self-publishing, it is all on you. And even though you can nowadays, there is a service to cover all of those things. You're still the person that's having to manage all of that.
Yep.
And finance it.
Yes. Yeah. Didn't you say there's also an audio adaptation as well that was done of your novel too?
Yeah. The audio. We did. Well, I did. I did an audio book of Fallen Heroes. I'll say I didn't read it. It was someone else.
Yeah.
No one's going to listen to me read it for that long. And so we did that, but then we did a 4-part audio drama, which was called Empire of Blood, and that was set between the first 2 books. So again, that was really interesting to kind of have that and to make it standalone. But again, it's that thing of, if you'd read Fallen Heroes, it was picking up another character and showing his journey and stuff. And again, it was really interesting in the same way, like with the artists, and having to sort of visualize how my characters are going to look on the page and having to sort of communicate that. But in the same vein, having how my characters sounded, which to a certain extent, again, I kind of had an idea in my head, but when I was getting, because they were sending in, people were kind of auditioning, which was just weird to get my head around.
Oh yeah.
And sending in sort of their parts and stuff, and I'm having to listen and like, does this sound like this character? But I think for Empire of Blood, to be honest, there was only really one character in there that was in the book. Some of those characters have since, because some of them were so good in the audio, they appeared in the second book. Basically, what I'm doing is just letting people do the work for me.
Do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, do the heavy lifting. I just swoop in. Yeah. But one of the main character in the audio drama is a character called Vincent Marconi, who is one of the main characters in not only in the, well, he's kind of a sidekick in the first book, whereas in the second book he is much more of a main character. So
Mm.
that was a big one for me, to sort of have to try and get an idea of how he would sound, and his kind of emotional journey and stuff was quite difficult. And also I kind of got my own hands dirty because I kind of did some of the editing, I did some of the music for it, and I'm a massive soundtrack fan. So for me to get to kind of try and put my own sort of soundtrack skills on it was yeah, it was really cool.
It's really weird. I auditioned. Well, I say I'd auditioned. I was sent a number of samples of for the audiobook for the new book, the Coward,
Oh
and
yeah.
and hearing your own stuff read back to you was kind of by different voices, and how it's the words don't change, but it's how people interpret them is really fascinating. And the guy that we went with for the audiobook, I knew he was the right one because they've all read like the same 2 pages or 3 pages. When he read it, I listened to it, I laughed on his audition tape.
Right.
It's my stuff, I wrote it.
Yeah.
But he just put little touches here and there. And when I looked at the book, I'm like, that's not in the text, but he's put little stuff in, and it made me laugh. And I thought, that's quite sad, I'm laughing at my own stuff. However, this guy's really good if he can do that. So he's the one. Were you doing that when you were auditioning people? You kind of going, oh, that's interesting. That sounds a bit not what I was thinking, but it sounds really good.
Yeah, and I think for me, because I think getting the guy who did like the audiobook he was fantastic, to a point of when we did the audio drama, we did it was a bit of a mix. So there was some prose, not much, but there was a little bit of prose, and there was the audio drama stuff. And it was the narrator from the book who did the narration for the audio drama.
Nice.
Mainly because I knew he was good, But there's a character in the audio drama called Victoria Sullivan, who was a completely new invention for that story by the person who'd written the script. I mean, I had involvement with the script, but I didn't come up with that character.
Yeah.
And the voice actress, her performance was just off. It was kind of, it reminded me of River Song from Doctor Who.
Right.
That was kind of the vibe I got listening to her. And the more I listened to her, the more she just felt like this kind of, what if Marion Raven would join like a secret society, fighting against the occult and stuff,
Yeah.
and she just nailed it, to the point of I then did Corey wrote a short, like a mini comic. It was only about 4 pages, which was a little origin for Victoria Sullivan, which then ballooned into a graphic novel, which is a Chimera Factor. And she was then the main character alongside sort of Steph, who's another main character. And I'd actually done a whole section, I'd done a whole sequence of her in the second book, which sadly I had to sort of edit out. But yeah, I think she'll find her way in somewhere to one of the books, I reckon. Cause she's great character.
Fascinating, just the way it kind of changed and evolved, and all the different, the comics and the nearly a TV adaptation and the audio drama, and so you're 2 books down. You're working on book 3. That's your next one. We've had some questions came in from people about the different things. So one question said, do you ever think you'll be done with this universe? Do you ever think you get the point where you go, yeah, or is it just there's always new ideas and new stories to explore?
When I wrote Fallen Heroes, I'd envisioned the trilogy. Didn't really know how that trilogy was going to take shape. I think some writers do. They have a whole idea and stuff. I was like, I want to do a trilogy. The first book. Oh God, I've got to do another 2 books. Hadn't thought that far. And I'd done this twisty turny story with loads of characters. I was like, I really should have just done one character. But then, the comics and stuff sort of came along, and in my head, I was still thinking, once I finish the 3rd book, that will kind of be it for Unseen Shadows, for that world, and to a certain extent, we haven't done any comics in a few years and stuff like that, so it's kind of reached almost like a natural crescendo, I guess. And weirdly, I then started working on this middle grade fiction book, which again kind of came out of nowhere. It was an agent who was interested in me at the time, and she asked me if I'd ever tried writing middle grade fiction. I was like, nope. It was just never, it was never even in my wheelhouse at all. And I didn't even know how to approach it and stuff. And I remember my wife saying to me at the time, because I was like, I don't think I'm going to do it. And she was just like, just write what you know. Because I was doing this whole thing about, I don't know how kids work today. I don't know how they work, And she was like, well, just write what you know. And I thought, well, what I know is what I was like as a kid and what I got up to as a kid. And we did get up to some weird stuff. And some of it was kind of remotely supernatural in some way. We did hunt for a lot of supernatural stuff. And so I came up with a story that was kind of, set in the 80s and set in North London and around a group of kids and stuff, and had that kind of Goonies indie vibe, but very much inspired by a film back in the day called The Monster Squad. I don't know if people remember it or not,
Mm-hmm.
but just that kind of real, just straight up adventure, And I kind of pitched the story as like Indiana Jones meets Grange Hill, because it's very, very very kind of North London based stuff. And as he says pick it up, and that's what we've got now, which is this is just a really, really, really rough proof. But I always like to, as a self-published person, the advantage is I can just send something off to get a copy.
Yeah.
And I always like to, even for a first draft, I like to just have a physical copy, because it inspires me on when I'm doing my second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever drafts, that actually this is going to be the end result,
Yeah.
And as I wrote it, originally it was supposed to be a standalone story to go to this agent, so she could take it off and pitch with no links to Unseen Shadows whatsoever.
Yeah.
But as I worked on it, it seemed the Unseen Shadows universe didn't want that. So little cameos started to feed in, and I kept telling myself, but that's okay, because it's still an original story. It just so happens I've mentioned this organization, which is also in the other books. And by the end, it's not like it's Unseen Shadows, but it is set in that universe.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And now that I've decided to self-publish it myself and to not go down the traditional publishing route again, I can firmly now set it in the Unseen Shadows universe. And what's great is, because this will come out before the third and final book, and which I'm plotting at the moment, a couple of the kids, it's not a spoiler to say, a couple of the kids will show up in the third book, but obviously they'll be adults. And I've already plotted out sort of the second book for these kids, because I loved it. It genuinely was the most fun I've had writing. It was just fun. It really was fun. And what I realized is I've got so many characters to play with that every story in its own right feels original to me. It doesn't feel like I'm just, great, I've got to crank out another book within the Unseen Shadows universe. Do you know what I mean? You get the same thing we've talked about. They all feel original to me. So why would I leave it? Why would I take the time to come up with a whole new world for myself?
It's a lot of work.
Yeah. So no, I think I'm going to be stuck here for a while, I reckon.
Well, if there's plenty of stuff there to tell, plenty of stories left to write, why not? Another good question we had, a couple of them. One was your biggest challenge as a writer and your proudest moment.
I'll do the one which is a bit of a, could be seen as a bit of a sad answer. I think for me, my biggest challenge was writing book 2, was writing Forgotten Warriors. Because during writing it, my dad passed away and my oldest brother passed away, and it were kind of double blows. And I think, and writing Fallen Heroes, my mum passed away, So it sounds a silly thing to say, but I almost started to think like, my writing was cursed. Like, if I put pen to paper, you know what I mean? If I start a new book, geez, what family members is going to go this time, And I coupled with that, any writer would probably, I don't know, writing that second book of a trilogy. I mean, I'll probably say the same thing when I've written the third book. So, circle back around then, but it's incredibly difficult to, unless you've probably got a roadmap of where you want to go. Maybe it might be easier. I don't know, but for me, I found it incredibly difficult to just get a handle on where I was going to go with it. Not that I didn't have space for the characters, but I just couldn't get my head around it. And then once I got my head around it, and I was starting to work on it and stuff, and then this stuff happened, and it knocked me down. It properly knocked me down to the point of I was like, I didn't think I would get back up in terms of my writing, and it took me a while to kind of get myself together. But I did, because I think as a writer, you primarily, and it's a cliche, but you do write for yourself.
Yep.
When you've had a good day and you're in that zone, you're in whatever world it is you've created for yourself. The rest of the world goes away. All the pressures of what you got to do later, be it the editing, be it the marketing, be it you're going to do an interview, be it you're going to go to school with kids to see kids, all of that goes away when you're really in that zone of writing and you love it. And I think I kind of had a few moments like that, and I suddenly sort of realized, even if it took me, another 10 years to finish it, I was going to finish it because this is what I love to do, you know? So yeah, so that was probably my biggest challenge, was kind of getting over that sort of hurdle, and it's still difficult. I think it is still difficult whenever I sit down to write. There's always that voice sometimes in my head anyway, with that kind of, you're not good enough and stuff like that. And I think when you're self-published, and again, I'm only speaking for myself, and I think it's only a feeling that I've only really, I think, come to terms with weirdly this week,
Right.
with me saying, as you know, Steve, with me kind of saying, right, Trader Curse Cobras, I'm going to self-publish. For me, that was me taking charge in a way that I'd never done before. I think to a certain extent, when I did Fallen Heroes, I kind of, even though I made that decision, I felt the decision was kind of taken out of my hands, with the whole kind of no one would touch it. So right, I'm going to do it myself. Whereas, I've had people interested in this, and it's kind of me now making that decision for myself. And I think there was always that nagging doubt in my mind that I'm not good enough because I wasn't traditionally published. That somehow I kind of lucked my way through, and at any moment someone's going to suddenly realize it, and suddenly it's like one of them reality shows, can't pay, won't pay, and suddenly a load of beefy guys are going to turn up to my house and take away all my books and my computer and go, you're not right, and but I think what I realized sort of this week was, I'm a writer because I write, and the only person who's putting those labels on me is me, and therefore the only person that can remove those labels is me. So I kind of really came to that conclusion, that whether I'm a published traditional author, or I'm a self-published author, or whatever, the one thing I can't change is that I'm a writer. I've been a writer pretty much all my life. That isn't going to change, and that's what I have to kind of embrace and double down on. The rest of it is just, it's window dressing. At our core, we're all writers. That's the one commonality we share. The rest of it is, it's just layers upon layers. Do you know what I mean? Strip it all away, you're a writer.
Yeah, it's true.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think the imposter syndrome goes away, really. I think there's that always thing of, you did it once, but can you do it again? And I don't know. And, and then you got expectations, you got people wanting to read it, or you know, when you're going to do the next one, or all this kind of stuff. And it's tough. Yeah, it's a tough game, but you're right because you want to, and you're right because you love it.
Yeah.
Because,
And I think, as you said, you know, it is imposter syndrome. And again, it's another, as well as being a writer, it's another thing that all writers share. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter whether you're up there, whether you're there, whether you're George R. R. Martin, whether you're Bob from down the road. Do you know what I mean? You all share that. Am I good enough? Can, like you say, am I good enough? Can I do it again? The minute you write your great piece of fiction, um, everyone is, oh, I've read that in 5 minutes, even though I've read it in an afternoon, even, but they don't realize the blood, sweat, and tears,
No.
and years of passion and work you poured into it.
Yep.
And when someone's like, oh, I read that in 2 hours, they're like, oh, okay, when's the next one going to be out? Come
Yeah.
on,
When's
it's
the next
just,
one?
it's difficult. It is difficult, but at the same time, it is, you can't beat it. You can't beat that where you pick up your book randomly. Maybe it's just me. You pick up a book randomly, you flip it to a page just to see, and it's years. It's a book you've done years ago, and you just pick up just to see if you read it, if it feels like you or if it feels like someone else. If it feels like another writer, I kind of feel like, okay, I was rolling on that day. Is that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, what was the other bit? There was another bit, wasn't there? Best moment.
Yeah, your proudest moment of your writing career.
My proudest moment was was the first book signing I did, which was terrifying. Absolutely terrifying, because I think and again, it's that thing of, I don't know how book signings are now, but when I turned up there, they basically gave me a load of copies of my books, and then they said, go out and talk to people, and effectively get them to come to your table so you can sign and sell your book. Because obviously, unless you're like a J.K. Rowling or something like that, or a David Gemmell or something, where people are going to be lining up, no one knows who you are. And yeah, they advertised it, and yeah, they stuck my name out, but I was just a bloke sitting at a table with a stack of books.
Yep.
And it was absolutely terrifying, but I did it. And I remember we had a bit of a queue going, which was lovely. And I remember this kid came up to me, and he was with his mum and stuff, and he was just looking, and she was like, go and ask him. And he was like, so, how did you become a writer? And I sort of told him the story about Raiders. I didn't say the film. I just said, my brother taking me to see a film. I'd got home, wanted to write, and my mum told me to just go and write something. And I said I was kind of about. I think I asked him his age, and I was like, I was about your age, and I just started writing, and I never stopped, And I did this big sort of. It was a much longer story than that, and I was just looking at the kid, and then I looked up, and it was basically like a crowd of sort of people with their sort of kids and stuff like that, which I hadn't noticed. And a load of them then obviously then sort of bought copies, and they liked what I had to say, and I think that was one of the few times, which we've just talked about, where I had no imposter syndrome. It was just me. It was just me being me, and I wasn't worried about what people were going to think. I wasn't worried that people were going to look at the book on the shelf, that I was holding, and go, who are you to be here, and yeah, that for me was probably my proudest moment. As much as we've talked about a lot of the other things, which have been amazing, but and also hoping as well that me telling that story to that kid, that they might go away and put pen to paper. I think, what better thing can you have as a writer to inspire someone else to get into writing?
Absolutely. I think that's a good place to wrap this up as well. So I'll put links down below so everyone can find you and all the books and everything else. But thanks for coming on tonight. Thanks for telling your story and talking about it. And we'll see you all next time. Good night.
Bye all.